Yeah, the purple. The purple, as you know, is one day going to be what?
Modern day Texas.
Part of America, right? Part of America. Yes, Texas, about other. What's probably going to happen when we take that territory? Relevant to this topic. We gain territory, what do we debate over?
Slavery.
We gain more territory, what do you think we're going to debate over?
Slavery.
Because the Missouri Compromise does not apply to Spanish territory, right?
Right.
So when we acquire all that purple stuff in the 1850s, we're going to have another debate, and this time it's not going to be as good. All right? It's 10 years later, what do we have? After that, Civil War, right? So every time we acquire territory, which is awesome, it's great to expand from sea to shining sea, right? Our manifest destiny, but it does mean that people who own slaves may want to take them there. And if there's no slavery legal there, then they won't be able to move there, they think. So this is going to create this sort of warning that the next time this comes up, oh, by the way, 30 years later when it happens, guess who's still alive? Who's the architect of the Missouri Compromise?
Henry Clay.
Henry Clay. Guess who's still alive 30 years later?
Henry Clay.
He's still in the Senate. All right. And so he's run for president 3 times at that point. All right. But he's old Henry Clay, and it'll be his last time, and he'll get one more compromise. So pretty much when Henry Clay dies, we have the Civil War. You know, that's the way it works. Not literally, but you know, he's known in history as the who? What's his nickname?
The Great Compromiser.
That's his nickname, the Great Compromiser. The guy who could somehow find, and he's from Kentucky. And that's about the middle of the country, isn't it? So he represents the sort of middle path. All right, now let's shift gears utterly to a must-know. So as of right now, you only have to know, so far, one major Supreme Court decision. What is it? Please know it. It's huge. It's huge. Marbury versus Madison. Yeah, it's the biggest Supreme Court case ever. Bigger than Roe, bigger than Brown. It's the biggest because it's the one that says what can the court do?
Determine
whether or not a federal law is unconstitutional, and that's mega. All right, that's judicial.
Judicial review.
Yeah, you were saying right on that judicial review. So this is the second case that you have to know, like a star beside. It is called McCulloch versus Maryland. Now, I reminded you yesterday that while the Federalist Party ceased to exist politically, it didn't where? In the judicial branch. John Marshall is a Federalist, all right? He is the Federalist in many ways when it comes to judicial rulings. All right, so Marshall and many members of the Supreme Court that were appointed by Washington and Adams are going to stay on the court through all of those presidents, Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Got it? So they're going to put checks on the DR's agenda. Now, here's probably the biggest case that you're going to learn besides Marbury, because it has two components to it that are so important to our history, legal history, constitutional history. So keep in mind that the Bank of the United States was chartered in Philadelphia. Okay, it's one of those old buildings down up there. And then there are other branches of it around the country. Not many, but there's one in Baltimore, Maryland. Okay, there was one in New York, as you can imagine. So these were branches of the bus, the Bank of the United States. The second bus, the one that Madison had initially vetoed but later passed. So the bank president is named McCulloch, okay? And he is of this branch, and he is conducting business when a law is passed in Maryland to place a tax on transactions at the Bank of the United States. In other words, money exchange will be taxed by Maryland from the bus. And so the bus president sues Maryland and says, you can't do that. We are an arm, an entity of the federal government. We're an institution created by the federal government. So they go all the way to the Supreme Court. And John Marshall issues one of his most famous opinions, his most famous rulings. And he starts off with a line that you should know, and that is the power to tax is the power to destroy. For years, I have told students, and again, I don't necessarily support this, but let's say you really are opposed to abortion, like really opposed to it. And as many times you've been hopeful about the judicial branch, it just doesn't seem to go your way. There is nothing illegal or unconstitutional about taxing abortion. And if you charge enormous taxes to the abortion procedure, would it make it virtually impossible to do? That's Marshall. The power to tax. It's completely legitimate. Do we hyper tax certain things we don't like people to do? Sure. President Obama helped pay for the Affordable Care Act with taxes on tanning booths, the usage of tanning booths, right? We tax liquor, we tax cigarettes, right? So while I don't personally necessarily say that's what we should do, keep in mind, I'm rambling here, but it is within the legal constitutional authority to put taxes on things, right? Power to tax, right there in the start of Article 1, Section 8. So he said, therefore, because of the supremacy clause, so that's an important part of the Constitution, Article 4, the laws of the United States and treaties are supreme law of the land. Well, what had created the Bank of the United States? A federal law? Yes, the federal law, right? So if you are taxing the federal government or its entity, could you in essence destroy it?
Yes.
Would that compromise or violate the supremacy clause?
Yes.
So can't do it. So Maryland can't tax the bus. It's like a small can't tax a big. Supremacy. National is over the states. States can't tax the federal. Social Security Administration building out here on 29. Pennsylvania County can't tax it. Campbell City can't tax it. No property taxes, no income taxes, none of that stuff. It's just federal government property, sitting there. Got it? So the feds are supreme. That's the supremacy clause. By the way, that was part of the small states plan. They wanted to make sure that if the government made a law, that the big states wouldn't just override it. Right? They wanted it to be national supremacy. Got that? But then the second may be just as important. So this law, this ruling is so big, it actually features like two major stories. The one is the supremacy clause. The second is it's going to settle a debate that had been sort of raging since the days of Hamilton and Jefferson. Jefferson and his immediate supporters had always said what was unconstitutional. Yeah, and the loose interpretation, good, right? To create what? The bus itself, good. To make the bus, you made up a power, they had been saying. John Marshall, the Federalist that he is, right, said, oh, by the way, since you're here to talk about the bus, let's go ahead and make this point. The bus itself is constitutional because of the what? The elastic clause, or the necessary and proper clause. So keep in mind, Hamilton and Madison had debated the merits of this clause with John Marshall listening to them. So he's basically telling the Federalist point of view right back to the court. And so Marshall says the doctrine of loose interpretation, loose construction, more importantly perhaps for us, the doctrine of implied powers, that's the last clause, implied, is constitutional. So not only is the bus constitutional, and we're saying it, thus it's Supreme Court, not random, well, not president, for example. President's going to determine the constitutionality. Who does? Supremes do, right? Supremes still do. So I told you guys this yesterday. Regardless of the outcome of this election, President Trump, at least one component of his legacy is secure. He has definitely installed a conservative element to the judicial branch of government. For a long time. I mean, Justice Barrett and Justice Kavanaugh, these are not young, old people, in terms of judges. They're certainly not RBG age, So, this is going to be a legacy for a very long time. And they're not. I don't believe any one of those three judges are like vocal Trump supporters. They're not like populists necessarily, but they are conservatives. That's for certain. And I think they do share that judicial philosophy. I do know that they don't always do what you want them to do, right, if you're a conservative or liberal. But in other words, like sometimes judges, they act independently. Can you imagine? Just like Hamilton intended. All right. So nonetheless, the next two. I tell you what. This year I have decided that I don't think these two are going to make it the cut. And I say that I didn't think about. I don't want to spend as long as talking about this. I do want you to come away with what was a result of it. But I don't need to know all the details. Basically, know this: Georgia sold some land. You don't have to know this. Just hear this. This flesh or deep fact. Georgia sold some land to some guys that were kind of ripping them off. So the next group of people in Georgia came along, the legislature, and said, well, we want to get that land back because they ripped the last group off, right? John Marshall says you can't do that. It's a contract. They didn't steal the land. They just fooled you. Your problem, right? So once you sign a contract, is that done? The importance of that is two things. First of all, the law that Georgia passed, the Supreme Court said didn't apply. So they invalidated, they judicially reviewed a state law. It was always thought to be a process, but now they proved it. And what that meant was Georgia couldn't get the land back because they signed a what? Contract. So it was a contract guarantee, which is, by the way, kind of what the framers wanted to do to protect property rights. Contract and property are inextricably confined, right? Well, keep in mind, it's a good question, Pranav, and I want to explain something to you. Being a liberal is an interpretation. It's a philosophy. It's not a party. You understand? Being a conservative is not a party. Now, in our country, we use the words interchangeably, but they not really fairly. So what should be the discussion is how the Constitution is interpreted by the judge. So what we call Justice Barrett is an originalist. An originalist is another word for a strict constructionist, meaning they don't want to go far. Justice Scalia was the sort of lion of conservatism when it came to not chiefs, but leaders who were very good. Chief Justice Rehnquist was another great conservative leader. So what they do is they look at the Constitution and they say, what is in it? Not what do they intend necessarily to be in it, but what's there? And if it's not there, who should be doing it? States, not the feds. All right. So in other words, originalists say, if you want to restrict abortion, well, that's your state's authority. Shouldn't be whose? The national government. Because the reason the national government is claiming the authority to do this is to defend the right to privacy. But the right to privacy, they would say, is not in the Constitution. There's no such thing as the right to privacy if you're conservative. At least like from the federal government. Now, your state can guarantee that. So the originalists tend to look at the nation and say what applies to the nation is the what? The Constitution as it exists, right? A liberal justice, who are typically loose constructionists, tend to say, well, the framers obviously intended more than what they just wrote here. When they talked about the right to bear arms, they weren't talking about the right to bear RPGs, right? Not in there, but obviously they consider reasonable restrictions. So they often use what's called the rule of reason. And they say things like, for example, there may not be a right to privacy in there, but there's the 3rd, 4th, and 9th Amendment in there, all of which guarantee privacy. They don't use the word privacy, but that's how they determined it to begin with in the case. So you have this debate. Now, justices who are conservative tend to say, that doesn't convince me. They're not compelled by the 9th Amendment or by the federal government's overreach in the 14th Amendment, they'll claim. So Republicans traditionally appoint conservative justices. But the thing about a good judge is they're not going to say, well, I'm going to vote this way if this case comes to me. They don't want to predetermine the outcome of a vote as a judge. They're going to be what word? Impartial. So I don't like to call judges Republicans. I don't like it because, first of all, at the national level, you don't run for the office, right? You're appointed. And once you're there for life. So we don't know for certain that people who we think might be conservative are conservative. President Eisenhower was a moderate Republican. He could have been a moderate Democrat. He's pretty much a moderate American, down the middle of the road. But he appointed a friend of his, who was the governor of California, to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. His name was Earl Warren. Earl Warren was a moderate Republican in California. Earl Warren became the most liberal justice we've ever had as Chief Justice. But Warren always said the reason that he did what he did was that the Congress didn't do what they were supposed to do. That means Congress was not acting on civil rights at all. So was segregation a violation of equal opportunity?
Yes.
Absolutely. Separate but equal wasn't equal. Therefore what? All 50 states are desegregated. Now that's huge power, right? All 50 states, because individual states have been determining segregation or not. But he believed under the 14th Amendment, states have to treat people equally, and therefore that had to happen. So he was a very liberal judge who was a Republican. Chief Justice, in fact. So it's not a guarantee, but it is, they are supposed to be neutral, Pranav. And I do think that they are neutral. I just think they have differences of philosophy about how they apply the Constitution. And it's that philosophical difference that creates such debate. Okay, it doesn't mean they're Republican or Democrat. Those guys, those are parties. Those are labels. Conservative is a belief system. Republican isn't a belief system. It's like a team. Like a banner or something you wave. Like I criticize parties on either side. I'm an American. That's what my priority is, and I'm an independent. Now, I voted for Republicans. I voted for Democrats. I voted for Libertarians. I vote for all the kinds of different people. But at the end of the day, justices are supposed to act the same way. They're supposed to be impartial. Okay? It's hard to get to that point. And it's a lot of things that go into it. So, contract rights are guaranteed. The same is true in charter rights. So, even though Dartmouth, by the way, I do want to introduce you to the most famous Federalist of his era, besides John Marshall. That's Senator Daniel Webster of New Hampshire. Dan Webster was the last major Federalist. And he'll end up being one of the major Whigs and also Secretary of State of the United States, a very famous person. There's a story written about him, the Devil and Daniel Webster. He's a popular figure in antebellum history. So Webster went to Dartmouth. You guys know Dartmouth College, one of the Ivies. And Dartmouth was about to have its charter, that's the document that creates it, amended, changed by the state of New Hampshire. And so the college sued the state of New Hampshire and said, you can't change our charter. You don't have that authority. It goes all the way to the court. Now, who had established Dartmouth College? This is really cool. King George III. He had chartered it, right? Like it was his original charter. But John Marshall said that charter is a what? A contract, and New Hampshire can't just go interfering with it. You understand? So one of the major outcomes of Marshall's rulings is the protection of property and contract rights. Meaning people can't just quit and not do what they're supposed to do or change their mind. In other words, this would be bad for what? Who would not be able to operate if states just whenever they felt like change the rules? Okay, it'd be bad for business. Really bad for business. Like you set up a business on good faith, and then the state says, "Oh, we're going to change the rules." You're like, "What? That ain't work. That's not how that works." So, this is. I don't really overemphasize these cases too much because the third case you really have to know is number 5. So, number 4 is another case. The reason number 4 is noteworthy, not because it's a lottery, but because the state of Virginia said it was illegal to make a lottery, like a private lottery, like a numbers game. And that was reviewed by who?
Marshall.
So the Supreme Court of the United States ruled on a state Supreme Court. So all of these are cases in which judicial review gets established. Can the federal Supremes overturn a state law? Yes. Can they stop a state from changing something? Yes. Can they uphold or overturn state Supreme Courts? So McCulloch and Marbury are so big because they apply kind of like the federal government. By the way, Marbury versus Madison, remember that case? Is the only time judicial review be used until 1857 on a federal law. That's how risky Marshall knew it was. If the Supreme Court was in, keep in mind, it's only 6 people. So if like 3 people ruled and 2 people voted against it and 1 didn't vote at all, 3 people could overturn, right, the will of the U.S. Congress. So they knew not to play with that game often. The next time they'll do it, you probably heard of the case. I mean, you meaning class. No, that's 1973. No, it is in the 18 period, but not 19.
Oh, it's the 19?
No, it's an 18. 1857.
Oh.
So it's 50, almost 50 years after. It's called Dred Scott versus Sanford. Have y'all ever heard of the Dred Scott decision? Okay, well, we'll get there. It's a hugely famous case. It's a guy carries a slave into the North. So a group of abolitionists sue, saying once the slave was in the North, he was what? Free. He was free. We'll get to why. I don't want to give away too much today. It's Kansas-Nebraska Act and all kinds of confusing stuff. But at the end of the day, it's only going to happen twice before the Civil War. So this is a judicial review of state-level decisions. States. See this? States. Maryland, Georgia, New Hampshire, Virginia, and Gibbons, another state case that has national ramifications. So you do need to know Gibbons v. Ogden. So I put a star beside these 3 cases. Marbury, McCulloch, and Gibbons. These 3 are like definitely important. The other three are there, and I'm telling you about them, but I don't think you're going to get an AP question on them. You could get one on these others. Okay? So Gibbons v. Ogden is called the Steamboat case. By the way, look at the dates on these cases. So Marshall's in there 20 years so far, right? He's still, I mean, he was a John Adams appointee in 1799. Right? 25 years later, still affecting life. Your kids will be talking about Justice Barrett. Your kids will be talking about Justice Kavanaugh. That's how long they're on there. You know who's on the court? Clarence Thomas. He was confirmed when I was a student in high school. You understand? So that's how long it's been. It's like crazy. You know, 30 and 40 years later, these guys are still making decisions. You know, like, who was the president? You know, like that's forever ago. Okay, so it's a big deal. So by the way, there's a guy named Robert Fulton who's invented something called a steamboat. This is the period of the Industrial Revolution having started. And so he's invented this steamboat, and it's created a commercial business. So people are now shipping goods back and forth between New Jersey and New York. If you've ever been up there at the Hudson River, you know, beautiful area. And they're going back and forth across the Hudson River. So New York grants a monopoly, okay, to one of Fulton's companies. And I always get the people confused, and it doesn't really matter which one's Gibbons, which one's Ogden, but this guy, I think it's Ogden, is the guy who has the monopoly. So that means he brings all the stuff, his boats, ferry, all the goods from New York to New Jersey. You might know, no George Washington bridges, no Midtown tunnels, you know, none of that stuff. So anything that's getting from New Jersey to New York is by boat, right? And the guy from New Jersey who has a steamboat business, or a burgeoning steamboat business, says that's not right. New York should not be able to give a monopoly to a guy who's coming to New Jersey. Because that's what key word?
Interstate.
Interstate. Now, New York can grant a monopoly to somebody between, you know, 5th Avenue and 34th Street, right? Because that's New York City. But they can't do it, Marshall says, only who can give rules and laws for interstate commerce? U.S. Congress, federal government. And I know it. So this is the very first case involving commerce in American history. And that's a biggie, because it is the beginning of this jurisdiction that is going to lay the ultimate power for the U.S. Congress. Today, the Congress rarely ever talks about the Supremacy Clause. It hardly ever comes up. Congress tries so hard to stretch this law. This is the Commerce Act was what the Congress stretched to create the Affordable Care Act. You guys know what the Affordable Care Act is? Obamacare. So they said the Obamacare law is an extension of regulating commerce. The 4 justices on the court who are liberal agreed with it. But then the Chief Justice, who is not liberal, sided with them too. Justice Roberts. Why did he do that? He didn't say because of commerce. It's some of the most interesting things you ever read. The legality of the Affordable Care Act. Keep in mind, it's not really regulating commerce, right? It's punishing you if you don't engage in a type of commerce. What type of commerce are you supposed to engage in under the Obamacare? You're supposed to buy insurance. If you can't afford insurance, some will be provided for you. All right, you know, that's the idea behind it. That's the whole. It's you know, the idea of creating a mandate. You have to buy it, but if you're too low income, you know, you can access to Medicaid. Okay. Well, that doesn't sound like regulating commerce, does it? It's like requiring commerce from conservative points of view. The Chief Justice Roberts says, well, no, it's not regulating commerce. If you don't do it, you have to pay a fine. You know what another word for a fine is? A tax. And so he said, under the taxing clause, now keep in mind, President Obama had campaigned on it was not a tax. So, you know, he didn't want it to be called a tax, but at the same time, it was ruled 5-4 constitutional. 4 the justice said, for what reason? Regulate commerce. The chief said he's siding with the majority, but he has what's called a concurring opinion, meaning he agrees for different reasons. And that's for the taxing authority. So it's really interesting. But have I told you guys about U.S. v. Lopez, the fairly recent case? So the case of U.S. v. Lopez, after Columbine, or right at the time of Columbine, you guys know what Columbine is? Terrible school shooting in Colorado. You know, so after that, or right around the same time, I forget, President Clinton was in office, they passed a law, several laws, gun laws. The assault weapons ban was passed, but one of the laws they passed was called these Gun-Free School Zone Safety Act. So a federal law prohibiting guns in public schools. people are like, yeah, that's smart. We should do that, right? And this teenager who's a high school senior, last name is Lopez, gets arrested for having a firearm at school. And the FBI comes and takes him, federal government, for violation of the federal Gun-Free School Zone Act. So Lopez and his attorneys say, wait a minute, where in the Constitution does it say the federal government has the authority to prohibit guns in schools? Like, under what power is that flowing from? Good question, right? So it goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supremes decide. Congress, what is your validation for this? And Congress says, oh, it's regulating commerce. And the Supreme said, that ain't regulating it. It's what? It's prohibiting it. And there's no commerce. You're not buying or selling the gun. You just had the gun. That's not commercial. The commerce means what? Trade of some kind, exchanging for monetary. And so they said, Congress, you've exceeded your rights, your power. You've gone too far. You don't get to use the commerce clause to ban stuff that is not a commercial enterprise. You understand? And so states get to do that. We have no guns in school, not because of the federal government, because who? Because the state says we can't, state law, and they're allowed under the Constitution. So this is federalism again. You know, the Congress has limits, and people sometimes forget this. Congress can't just pass any law that affects everyone. You know, and so that's why it creates a debate, not because people don't like it. I think there's a sentiment that Obamacare was unlikable, you know, thus you didn't like it and should be repealed. Well, that's one thing, but that doesn't make it unconstitutional. Does it regulate commerce is a completely different debate, though, because requiring commerce is a different word than regulate. And so that's 4 justices agreed with that that's regulating it, a 5th, and not so much. You know, so it's an interesting thing about constitutional law. But the regulating interstate commerce is uniquely whose job? The federal government. States cannot dictate, and that's one of the reasons why. Have you guys used internet for commerce? But bought stuff on the internet? Yeah. So I'm a member of band fan club. You know, hard to imagine. I'm a fanboy, right? And one of the guys that I'm a fan of, or have been from years and years ago, when I was a little bit older than you, is Dave Matthews. Well, Dave Matthews Fan Club operates their business in Virginia. He's from Charlottesville. Well, he's from South Africa by way of Charlottesville. And so if I buy anything from the fan club, I have to pay state taxes on it. Any other American outside of Virginia does not, which is interesting, right? You know, because they can be taxed where? In Virginia, but they can't be taxed where? Anywhere else, you know, unless it's a federal tax. And there is no such thing as a federal sales tax. You know, so thank goodness, you know, it's one less tax we have to pay. All right, you know, but nonetheless, that's kind of an interesting story, I think, as far as who gets to regulate commerce. So I want to point out that Monroe's principal advisor is probably the man most suited for this career ever. And his name is John Quincy Adams. Now, John Quincy Adams is the Secretary of State and the son of John Adams. All right. John Quincy Adams has been to Russia. John Quincy Adams has been to the Netherlands. He's been to France. He's been to Britain. And we had never had a more well-traveled at that time in history Secretary of State. And he had trained under some of the great foreign ministers of Europe. John Adams had sent him abroad to kind of learn and work under the Washington and his own son administration and his administration. So Adams has a lot of experience. And notice that even though his father was a Federalist, John Quincy Adams is in whose cabinet? Monroe, right? They are, yeah, absolutely good. So he is the bulldog of the Secretary of State. That means he's smarter, really, than a lot of the other house dogs, so to speak. So Monroe is going to use him and vice versa. They're going to work together really well. They're an excellent pair. And that's where you have one of the most interesting moments in history where we get a phrase called the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, you should have learned about the Monroe Doctrine at some point in life. So what happened is, if you take a look at this map, by the way, notice that purple is no longer the old word. What was the old word for the purple?
Spanish territory.
Well, Spanish territory now is what?
Mexico.
United States of Mexico. That's right. That's Mexico. Independence since 1821. That we all noticed that here in America at the time. People were attentively watching what was going on south of the border. Father Hidalgo and his movement. All right. But this is the one that's particularly noteworthy to me. You see the dashes? Oregon country up here? Oregon country was jointly shared by 2 countries. What 2 countries claimed Oregon?
United States and Britain.
U.S. and Britain, or British Canada, right? U.S. and Britain. So we both had it. Well, take a look then and see what are areas we should probably be concerned about. We first had dealt with Florida. Remember that part? Well, actually, we're going to deal with it here. But we'd already been talking about Florida. But let's come down to this border with Oregon. You see this long red border?
Yeah.
All right. That's kind of an awesome thing, right? But it wasn't quite there yet. It will be after this. See, we hadn't figured out what the boundary, and it's an important distinction, you know, the boundary between the United States and Canada was. We had bought Louisiana, but we didn't really know exactly where that stopped. So what does John Quincy Adams and James Monroe not want to have to do again 3 years later? Go to war, right? And really Britain had been settling out here already for fur traffic. The Columbia River Valley. You guys know Columbia here? This is Columbia out here, the Columbia River Valley. It's where the state of Washington is. Okay? State of Oregon is, that area. So we decided we weren't quite ready to make a decision on that. So in 1818, we create a convention, they call it, it's a treaty. Treaty of 1818, or I would prefer you to think of it as the Oregon Treaty of 1818, right? And it says we're going to do what with Oregon for the next decade? Joint control. So we didn't divide it up. Oregon just chill there. But there's a reason why Adams was concerned. He wanted to make sure that us and Britain asserted that that's where we would be. Why? Russia. Yeah, Putin. No, not literally. The Tsar. We were concerned. John Quincy Adams was looking at that map. He knew what was going on. He said, who's going to just keep on coming southward since there's nobody here right now? The Russia. You guys ever notice the tail in Alaska? It looks kind of weird down there. This part, well, that's because these were Russian explorers. And they were coming down the coast to places like Vancouver and stuff like that. And we or Britain didn't want to have Russia to deal with in North America. So we said, we're making a treaty. And we'll officially stop it, the shared boundary, at a place called 5440. This is going to come up again later, the top border, 5440. So we share that, and we have the longest undefended border in the world. Our northern border is the 49th parallel, the 49th line of latitude, okay? And so it runs from the Lake of the Woods, which is in Minnesota, all the way to Oregon at the time. And they're just going to continue it on out in 46. All right, but we'll be, and you can look up there. Have you ever noticed how straight and smooth that northern border was?
Yeah.
That's John Quincy Adams. Working with the British, working with George Cannon, the British Foreign Secretary. All right? Yeah, he was a smart dude. We don't need to mess with that, right? It's a bunch of beaver and what? I don't know. Native Americans out here, maybe. But this one is kind of bigger. It's called the Adams-Onis Treaty, but it's also called the Florida Purchase Treaty. So who's kind of reeling? Who's been damaged? Who's been hurting? The 1800s. Spain. And their last possession in the East is Florida. They've been bumped, and the Panhandle, like Pensacola, that area. They've been bumped out of all of this, and then they're about to lose this, remember? Mexico's getting ready to be independent. So who has invaded Florida? Literally, led troops into Florida. Andrew Jackson. Jackson is pursuing Spaniards who are helping runaway slaves, and he's also attacking Seminoles, right? He's an Indian fighter. So he goes into Florida, he's beating them up, he's killing people down there. The Spanish are angry about this. Their foreign secretary's got him Onis, see up there. And John Quincy Adams says, well, you know the easiest way to deal with this, don't you? Just sell it to us. That is not what the Spanish wanted to do. They didn't want to sell Florida, but what kind of, you guys know The Godfather, the movie series, the trilogy?
I know of it, but not.
Well, the thing that The Godfather, Don Corleone would frequently do is he would give the people he was dealing with an offer they couldn't refuse. You understand? So
either you buy it, or you sell it, or we take it.
That's right. Either you sell it to us, or we take it from you. All right. And so I don't like John Quincy Adams literally said it that way, but diplomatically, that's how it was. So the Spanish figured they better cut their losses and run, and they sold us Florida. I want to point out that Monroe's cabinet, with the exception of JQA, were highly critical of Andrew Jackson. They said he shouldn't do this. He shouldn't be able to do this. And John Quincy Adams was like, this is an opportunity. We get Florida for this. So that's why he's called a bulldog among the Spaniards. He saw opportunity. So Monroe and JQA get Florida, settle Oregon for now, jointly. But they're still a little concerned about the Brits and the Russians. And certainly the Spanish too. What has happened by the 1820s? What has happened in Latin America? Simón Bolívar, Toussaint Louverture, Miguel Hidalgo. Who are these people? The revolutionaries, right? And so throughout all of Latin America, they're having these massive revolutions. big time, particularly in South America, some in Central America. So what are many of them establishing as their forms of government? Democracy, that's right. It's inspired by the French and us, our revolution. So they're creating, or attempting to create, democratic states. They were able to do this primarily because who had sort of tied Europe all up? Who kept Europe so busy they couldn't deal with like their foreign stuff? Yeah, Napoleon. Well, now Napoleon's gone, right? He's gone, and so now these European powers are kind of eyeing their former possession. They're like, I think I want them back, right? And so Monroe and Adams are concerned that what might these countries try to do? Well, no, not us. We fought the War of 1812 to make sure they don't think that. No, to take Honduras back. To take Mexico back. To take Bolivia back, right? And so what we see America do is assert. Now, by the way, it's funny how this works. If you're reading, the details are in the reading. The British are the ones who actually proposed this first. The British proposed to John Quincy Adams, why don't us and you in America, why don't we jointly tell the world that they cannot colonize the Americas? And JQA is like, yeah, but if we say it with the Brits, who's the authority figure in that statement? Britain. I mean, this is Britain, right? This is Imperial Britain in the 19th century. Are we in a position to be the co-equal partner with Britain in 1820? No. But who might still uphold it anyway? See, Britain wants to trade with what places? Honduras, right? Yeah, Britain wants to trade with these former countries. They're not trying to take them over. They realize that that's a problem, and they want to trade. So they're assuming if they can keep the Europeans out of taking them over, they'll be able to trade. Well, JQA's like, yeah, they're going to do that anyway. So we announce it. The word is unilaterally, without who's input, without who coded it. The Brits. We say it's usually referred to as it should be the Monroe Doctrine. It's really the JQA doctrine. He's the Secretary of State who devised it. But Monroe had been the Secretary of State, and he was a smart guy too. And so they do it kind of together. And what they do is has two major developments. Now, one is sort of almost obvious. One is the principle of non-intervention. We are not going to get involved in European affairs. So that's a consistent with what? Neutrality Proclamation, Embargo Act, non-intervention. In other words, Monroe continues our pattern of isolation, or certainly Western Hemispheric isolation. We're not going to be involved in your affairs. Take note. But on the flip side, no one can ever again colonize in the Western Hemisphere. Now, it doesn't tell the Brits you got to get out. The Brits had a few colonies like Guyana and Canada. But it does say those countries are democracies and they have our protection. Now, the irony is in 1823, we're not in any position to protect them. You understand? We're not a navy. We barely do anything, right? But who can? Britain. Yeah. And so they leave us alone. They leave the Western Hemisphere alone. In the 1860s, in the middle of the Civil War, France will put a puppet dictator on the throne of Mexico. And Napoleon III is the Emperor of France, and he puts a guy named Maximilian, he's an Austrian, on the throne of Mexico. We're busy fighting the Civil War. We can't really deal with Mexico, can we? At the end of that war, our Secretary of State, Touart, says, France, if you don't get rid of that, every bayonet from the American Civil War is marching south. France leaves. Mexicans kill that archduke. They shoot him in firing squad. All right. In other words, we're not going to let European powers do what? Take over any country in the Americas. This is why President Kennedy will assert a very interesting quarantine over what country? Cuba. An event called the Cuban Missile Crisis. Oh. Yeah, you ever heard of it? Soviets put nukes in Cuba. They didn't take over Cuba, but we figured they were making Cuba get sick. So we put a quarantine around it. Then they had to take the nukes out, right? So, the point is that America, since the 1820s, has viewed our hemisphere, the Western Hemisphere, Canada all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, as our distinct sphere of influence. And Europeans are not permitted to try to take over countries. Now, unfortunately, Latin American countries, while many of them try to adopt democracy, they don't adopt capitalism. They don't distribute the land that was owned by a wealthy aristocratic class from Spain. And so that means, as one Hispanic author writes, Latin America has what's called the mystery of capital. They don't have access to property like we do here in America. All that land was never distributed to the peasants. Not in a communist system, just in what do we do in America with land? We distributed it. I mean, when we think about the Land Act of 1820, which is also in this chapter, the Land Act of 1820 is $1.25 an acre. That's practically giving it away. That's like paying a fee just to handle the paperwork, and then you can go live there. You know, I mean, that was cheap. Yeah, even then that was cheap. So yeah, if you guys understand it, our history is different. But one of the reasons why Latin America for a long time will not consider it. By the way, nobody in Latin America really knew what the Monroe Doctrine was in 1823. It's not like they were picking up the paper down in La Paz and saying, "Oh yeah, way to go, America's got our back." But this would come to be very important later. Okay, this would come to be very meaningful. And today, we have what's called the Organization of American States. We have NAFTA, which is a free trade agreement. And so our hemisphere, our principal trade partner is Canada. We're major trade partners with Latin America. We have DR-CAFTA, which is Central American Free Trade Agreement. So, we've always asserted that the democracies and the governments in the Western Hemisphere were our influence specifically. And it won't be until the 20th century that you'll see us really start to be interested about what's happened in Europe, except for trade purposes. Okay, well, I'm going to conclude with that. That's my last of that slide and the last of this chapter. I'm going to unlock the chapter quiz, and I would like you to